I'd put you in my pocket, push the button through the hole to lock it. Hold on to you, you're like a treasure. Walk across my hand, it'd be a pleasure. You could come with me. You could come with me. Oh, you're such a sweet little misfit. When your smile falls down, I wanna lift it. Wanna make you better. Wanna run away together.
Okay, welcome to Delisted of History, the podcast about people you probably didn't learn about in school. My name is Fega, and I actually didn't think of something ahead of time. I've been doing so well. I'm your history person who's had way too much caffeine for how late it is in the day.
Okay. I am Issa. I am your dirty anarchist who has had half of a margarita, and
doing great.
we're doing great. Yes, but stopped my caffeine intake pretty early today, actually.
And we have a special guest with us, Jeffrey Ryan.
Hi.
Hello.
It's great to meet you too. And I am fully caffeinated. I went for the hazelnut right before we got on the broadcast, so we should be amped.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so I fully just copied and pasted your bio from your website into my notes. So give people an idea who you are. So Jeffrey Ryan is an author, adventurer, photographer, and historian. He has written several books about his outdoor exploits. His fascination with hiking trails and people and places have found just off the beaten path. His debut book, Appalachian Odyssey, a 28-year hike on America's Trail, published by Downey's Books in 2016, was hailed by the former executive editor of National Geographic as a classic of nature and travel writing, and set off a national tour in your 1985 VW camper, which I'm very jealous of.
That's awesome.
And you've written a bunch of other stuff. The one that I've read is This Land Was Saved for You and Me, which I think is your most recent.
Yes, it is. Came out just last year, hardcover by Stackpole Books, and very excited about that little 100+ year delving into our conservation history.
Yeah, it was really cool. I also loved that the chapters were short, which really did great things for my ADHD brain, because I was like, I'm making progress. This is great.
I try to keep a nice pace up in my books, and this story had so many great baton passes between the unknowns and the more knowns, and it's always the way of history, right? We learn about the big name people, and even what we learn about them is kind of truncated, but oftentimes there are people who set them up for success that are sort of lost, and which is why I think your podcast really resonates with me. It's a wonderful premise.
That's what it's all about. Yes.
Cool. And I loved how the book started so much further back than I expected, because I admit I was sort of like, I mean, I knew that like the National Park Service didn't just like emerge out of like TR's head or whatever, but it's still like, I never really looked at it that closely. It was just sort of around, like Pinchot shows up a lot when you talk about Gilded Age. And I'll be honest, the main thing I remember about him is that he has a ghost wife. But
what is a ghost wife?
It's actually a really sad story.
Oh gosh.
He got married and his wife died. Did they even actually
No,
get
they
married?
were engaged, and it was called off.
Oh, man.
And it was much later when he got married for the first time, actually.
Yes. Yeah, and he would do seances to talk to her and stuff.
Oh.
He was
wow.
devastated.
I'm sure.
Devastated, and
yeah.
actually poured himself into work was one of his outputs of that.
Wow. It would have been wild to be. This is one of my fallbacks on this podcast is to always relate to what would influencers do today with all of this. And I feel like the era of seances and and what's the word for it? Actually, the era of seance. There's the actual movement.
It was the spiritualist movement.
The spiritualist movement. would have been so many influencers would have
Oh my
gotten in on
gosh.
that, being like, guys, I have the best seance ready for you. They have live seances. Like,
And
I don't
Houdini
know.
would be like
Yes.
killing everybody. It would be
Yeah.
so good.
I'm old enough to
Absolutely.
also remember the Ouija board craze of the sort of early 60s. And, everyone had Ouija boards and had this thing where they put their hands on it and ask questions and move the dial around. And
Oh yeah.
Do you know they made a Ouija board for girls
Really?
specifically, like a pink
Wow.
Ouija board?
That's
It's
insane.
it's one of those objects that has like gendered marketing that people really causes you to scratch your head and think, what was the pitch on this one? Like, what was the audience? When did they think that girls like weren't gonna be into the
Right.
normal Ouija board?
Yeah, I definitely grew up with the Ouija boards because I was a kid in the like post satanic panic when all the like Democrat parents wanted to be like, I don't believe in satanic panic. Here, have
Right,
all the
right.
occults.
I'm a cool mom. Yeah.
We love occult.
That would
in this house.
be a fun thing to have a sort of 70s theme night with the fondue pot and the Ouija board and the that
Yes.
would be something to bring back.
Oh, I love it.
D-list
I love it.
fads.
Oh,
Honestly.
yes. Yes.
That
Oh
would
my
be really
goodness.
fun, actually. We talked about malls the other day. It's sort of
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so you picked a person that I'd never heard of. Franklin Benjamin
Huff,
Hough.
I
Is that how you
think.
say his last name? Huff. That's works too. So Franklin Benjamin Hough, who was actually really hard to find information about, and I ended up finding a biography of him on JSTOR from like 1932 or something. He was born in Martinsburg, New York. And actually, as I go through, we talked about this on the email, but just so our listeners know, I'm just going to kind of like do my normal thing where I just kind of do and he was born and then he did this. And I have places where I have questions for Jeffrey. And also, you should feel free to jump in and with anything you want. Also, if I say something that's wrong, because I don't really know what I'm talking about with the forestry movement. So... Okay, so Hough, he was born in Martinsburg, New York on July 20th, 1822 to Dr. Horatio Gates Hough and Martha Pitcher Hough. And my favorite thing I found about this was that his parents wanted to name him Benjamin Franklin, but he already had a cousin with that name, so they just like flip-flopped the names.
Which was so cruel to do to a historian, because I can't help it. I have to pause every time before I say his name because I want to say Benjamin Franklin.
Well, especially, I'm a tour guide in Philly.
Right.
Like, Ben
It's
Franklin,
hard to say whether that would have like launched him into more obscurity or
Right.
less obscurity. You know what I mean? Hard.
There's
Could
a lot
have
of-
gone either way. Yeah,
there are a lot of Benjamin Franklin whatevers
that's true.
in on the D list. So his father, Horatio, which is a very good name,
It is.
was a doctor and was the first doctor to settle in Lewis County, just west of the Adirondacks. And I thought this was interesting because I meant to look this up, that this is a part for two things. One, I think this is part of just living on the East Coast, is when I say New York, I think the city first, and then I have to remind myself there is a very large,
A whole
rest of
other
the state.
99.9% of land.
Yes. And I forget how much of it was like European settlements actually came a lot later than I think of, given relative to like Pennsylvania, for example, where they were like just plowing their way out to Pittsburgh. I don't know if this is the same region that Public Universal Friend was hanging out in. I should have looked that up before I went on the thing. But Western New York has a lot of interesting characters.
Yeah. Tell me, is this the era? Where is just so I can get my bearings, where is like the Mormon church at this time? Are we around that same era of like Rochester?
Not yet.
Okay, all right, we're not there.
20 years, I
Okay.
believe.
Got it. Cool.
But yes, upstate New York. They've always got something interesting going on up there.
Oh, I do.
Franklin Hough, though, he was not starting new religious movements. He was rambling in the woods and collecting rocks, which I love because I was a rock picker-upper as a kid too. And he was very curious. like his namesake, and an avid reader. And he kept really extensive diaries, which is amazing for historians.
Yes.
Yes. He graduated from Union College, which is Schenectady, New York. That's one of those words I've heard said many times. And
I've actually been there a lot, so I have a lot of practice saying Schenectady.
In 1843, he got his MD from Western Reserve College, which is now called Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, in 1848, and set up a medical practice in St. Lawrence County. And he picked where he set up his medical practice based on, in part, where there were good mineral deposits, like interesting mineral deposits. Like he was like, this would be a good place for a medical practice, but I need to make sure there'll be interesting rocks.
There's so many people in this era that are multifaceted. We can talk about that later, but the generalists ruled the world. The specialists, it seemed like most of the people in my book aspired to be nothing in particular and knowledgeable in general. And that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, especially because a lot of these guys, when I was reading it, I was like, how are they paying rent? Because like some of them are just independently wealthy, but they weren't all. A lot of them were just like middle class.
This is one of my this reminds me of just like the rest of the jack of all trades quote that everybody always leaves out, is that like the jack of all trades is a master of none, but then it finishes, but is oftentimes better than a master of one. Which is like, like it's like, if this is sorry, I feel like I
no, that's great. That's great. Exactly what we're talking
but
about.
It's like it's this thing, it's this beautiful thing of before the era that you have to choose that one thing that we have to do today. That it's like, you're going to be a doctor. Okay, that's the only thing you can do. And that's why I stopped studying to be a doctor, because I was like, I need to do other things. Yeah.
Yeah, especially, I mean, that's doctor's like an extreme example, but I mean, even when I was in college, which was like 20 years ago, I remember I was student teaching at a local high school with the band, and the kids were telling me about how they were going to like go get their bachelor's degrees in like food science. And I'm like, why aren't you majoring in like, I don't know, biology? Like, you're 17. Like, I was like, I'm 21 and I don't even know if this music teaching thing is what I want to do. And it turned out it was not. Like, and it's just become even more so. Like when you see job postings and stuff, like people aren't being ridiculous for doing that, because job postings are asking for these like really oddly specific educational backgrounds. So I got really lucky that I'm in a industry where people come from all over the place, and it's more about what you do and what you've done than like what you studied in school. But I
love this doctor that loves rocks. This is so cool.
I love him. I'm very fond of him now.
Yes.
So he set up his rock collecting medical practice, and when he wasn't being a doctor, he dedicated his time to the study of the history and climate / meteorological / botanical life of the region. And this is where I started having to jump around a little bit, because the timeline didn't.
He started writing extensively in that era, writing histories about things like the history of Union College and the history of some of the towns of the area, which was a lot of people in this era were also aspiring authors who had various levels of success, mostly non-success. But because print was so important in that age, and there were so many outlets, newspapers, books, people were very hungry for basically that information medium. It's sort of like the internet now, right? It's an insatiable beast. And he tried to fashion a career doing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it says here he published, the ones I wrote down were a history of St. Lawrence and Franklin counties, New York, and a history of Jefferson County in the state of New York. And I love these books. I come across them every once in a while in my research. Every county in the country, I would guess, has one of these books, probably written around the same time. And they are of varying quality and joy to readness. But it's so interesting. I have like 2 of them of Salem County, New Jersey sitting on my mantle. Like, it's just people just loved writing these things. I had another thought about this and it's gone. Oh, I think this was the era of people bemoaning that people were like reading newspapers and dime novels too much. So like now people are like, you see people on the train and they're on their phones and nobody's talking to each other. And in those days it was like all these people are reading the newspaper instead of talking to each other.
Or filling their head with that garbage, Yeah.
The garbage, the climate history of this county.
Somebody had, there's a great cartoon somewhere of people, like somebody like getting angry about like, everybody's on their phone on the train. And then the next image is like in the 70s, people on the train that are just everybody's stuck in the newspaper. Like the newspaper is just like everybody's their heads right in the middle.
It turns out nobody likes to talk on the train.
Turns out
as someone
people just
who
want to get to work.
A not infrequent SEPTA writer.
SEPTA is not the place that the Philadelphia subway is especially, unfortunately, not the place where you want to start up a conversation with somebody, unfortunately. No. I love the people of our city, just not on the train.
They may strike up a conversation with you because they want to sell you something that they swiped from CVS. Yes. Yeah. Get some good deals that way. So in 1854, Hough was appointed superintendent of the 1855 New York census, which would include agricultural and industrial statistics. And I thought this was so weird when I read this the first time. Like, I was like, what does this have to, like, why do I care? Why?
First of all, he had made a local name for himself. He knew the lay of the land. And so he knew a lot of people. So to go door to door collecting, and he was a statistician, right? So it's like, here's the guy for upstate New York. And he was so good at it, he was invited back for a sequel.
Yeah, and I have this great quote of his from, when's this from? Oh, it had to have been from the 1860s because he's talking about, I'll just read it. It's very well done. In comparing and tabulating upon charts the statistics of distribution and amounts of lumber as shown in the census of 1855 and 1865, I had noticed falling off in some regions, indicating an exhaustion of and an increase in others, showing that new fields had been, I didn't write this right. I guess new fields have been found. Did not take much reasoning to reach the inquiry, how will these other supplies last and what's next? So like he noticed these different, the
10-year gap in the census, there was massive forest devastation due to clear cutting in those 10 years. And having been the guy who knew what it was like 10 years before, he went, oh my gosh, look at what's happening. And then, interestingly enough, in 1864, a book had been published called Man and Nature by George Perkins Marsh. And he was really the first one to have this aha moment about man's effect on the environment. And Hough read that. And all of a sudden, he was like, forestry, this guy's absolutely right. We need to start replenishing the forest. And what a revelation it was to Hough. It changed his life.
And then a little event interrupted things called the American Civil War. And I loved this, that he was an inspector for the Sanitary Commission, because I love the Sanitary Commission because they just showed up places and were like, wash your hands.
Right.
Like, it is disgusting in here. Just sweep, please.
And the other
I had no
the other piece of that was they had to figure out a way to get bandages and other supplies, medical supplies, to the front. And they had no infrastructure for doing it. So they hired to head up this thing Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park and landscape designer, and put him in charge of the Sanitary Commission. and Hough worked for him. So there's another interesting meeting of
Yeah.
minds, significant minds in history.
And the U.S. Sanitary Commission too. I always thought of it as a woman's thing because a lot of women were involved. And to be fair, they were the ones who were showing up and being like, maybe you should like
Dress your wound,
clean.
right. Change your bandage, right.
Like maybe you might have better outcomes.
Oh Lord.
I mean, this was back in the day when it was like you did not wash hands. Like you would go straight from one bullet wound to the other, and everyone was like, "Why is everybody getting the same illness? We don't know yet
Right.
because we're not quite there on germ theory. We're
Or
getting there, but we're not quite
leaving
there."
bullets
Yeah.
in because we didn't know how to take them out. You know, it was really scary stuff. Or
Yeah.
amputations,
Yeah.
which is a whole other grisly part of it. But they didn't sanitize anything.
Oy.
I will say though, this is one of my pet peeves. They did have anesthesia.
Yes.
They didn't always have enough,
Right.
but they had it.
Mm.
And sometimes it would make things blow up
Right.
because it was ether. Well, in the South, mostly had ether. They mostly use chloroform in the North.
Oh,
But
Lord.
this is a pet peeve of mine.
Or they
People-
bit the
yeah.
bullet, which is where that came from. So they wouldn't.
Oh yeah, here in Philly,
Mm.
we have the first public hospital, and on every single one of my tour buses, people love talking about how if you were a Quaker, so you didn't smoke or drink, they would hit you in the head with a hammer until you
Jeez.
passed out.
Oh Lord.
So, from that uplifting topic,
Yeah.
so he began to write to people in France and Germany regarding forestry because of this, what he had noticed in these two censuses. And this was where forestry as a topic of study was happening in the West, was Germany and France. And so he started amassing his own library of relevant books. And his definition of forestry, I think, is important because I know this is one of those things that before I started learning about the Gilded Age, I just sort of was like, forestry, like you take over forests. I don't know. But it's actually really important. So how he defined it was that branch of knowledge that treats of woodlands, their formation, maintenance, and renewal, the influences that may affect their welfare, the methods employed in their management, the removal, preparation, and use of their products, and the economies that may be gained skillful operation, which is important because there's this whole forestry versus wilderness movement, which I think is fascinating, and I'd love to hear.
Yeah.
Jeffrey talk
Well,
about it.
what's amazing about Hough is, as I mentioned, he read the book Man and Nature and thought, Marsh is absolutely right. He was totally on board. It was like a mind meld. And he said at that point, you know what? I'm going to give up my medical practice and even my looking for rocks and become an advocate for saving the forest. And what was happening, just sort of to set the stage, is that the deforestation was so wholesale. Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont had been largely clear cut, to a point where, to take Vermont as an example, 85 to 90% of the state was devoid of trees, which we think of now as,
Wow.
that's absurd. When you go to Vermont, it's nothing
You go
but.
up there to see the colors.
But
Wow.
they went through the Midwest, and they were rapidly approaching the West, and everything was being cut. And to take the Adirondacks for example, the loggers came in and wiped everything out. They bought the land, they wiped out the trees, and then they bolted. And so they weren't caring at all about legacy forest or anything. They were just on to the next forest. And they weren't paying taxes. So most of what is now the Adirondack State Park or reserve was clear cut with unpaid taxes, and the state took hold of it and said, we need to do something with this land. It's not generating any income.
Huh.
And there's a whole story about how that happened. But Hough was living in the shadow of this clear cutting. And he went, oh my gosh, I'm going to be on the forefront of making a case for forestry as not only restoring what we had, but making it very clear to the forestry uh, people, the lumber operations that were really afraid of any regulation at all, to say, I'm not against forestry. And this is really a key sort of thing that happens all the way through is we're talking about having your profession be viable in a generation or two. The rate we're going, there isn't going to be anything.
Yeah.
Um, and
Huh.
so he took it upon himself to start going around and giving lectures about the importance of forestry, how we need it as a sustainable thing to have to build railroads, to build sailing ships, to build houses, all of that. And if we keep going, we're not going to have the resource. And so he was going around as early as 1873, even earlier than that. But in 1873, everything started coming to into focus for him. And he gave a speech in Portland, Maine, where I'm sitting right now, actually, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science in August of 1873. And it was called On the Duty of Governments in the Preservation of Forests. And what was really neat about that was he made a couple of really avant garde sort of proclamations. One was to build out a sustainable forestry movement to have preserved forests that were managed. But the second part of that was a groundbreaking idea to establish forestry schools so that people could be taught in proper forestry methods. This predates the first forestry schools by more than 25 years. And he was way out ahead of the curve. Pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, and then there were later on, or maybe now, I'm not sure. One thing I thought that really struck me is that the forestry movement is also about use of the land. So it's not just
Mm-hmm.
preservation, but it's also use of it. Versus the wilderness movement, which was like
Right.
just leave
Let
it,
let Mother
just
Nature have
let
her
it do its
way.
thing,
Right. Well,
Mm. This
which
is
I
so,
found fascinating.
yeah, this is so interesting. Just only because I did not know until very recently that before, I mean, like before the coal industry in Appalachia, we always think of the coal Appalachia being, it started with the coal industry and it was all coal. That it was all about forests. They were clear cutting everything. That was the first major industry that was in those mountains. And you can imagine how much damage that ended up doing long term. Those are of course all old growth, super old trees that are now still very new, that they're regrowing now, and it's not as much of a they're still logging, and it's still a whole thing in some areas, but it's a part of why you see flooding as much
oh my
as we still
gosh,
do.
I'm glad you mentioned that because the other two pieces that really put modern forestry on the map were um, the ecological issues, the economic issues, and also the
Hmm.
ecological. So people
Hmm.
started recognizing that what Marsh had said way up front was right on the money, that droughts and floods were happening because of the clear cutting and the mudslides. And one of the things that actually made the Adirondacks come into fruition was the fact that the merchants in New York City were afraid that the Erie Canal, which was seeing great water rises and falls, so it would be one third of its capacity, and then it would be overflowing. And they thought, "Oh my gosh, if the canal isn't viable, then the only one to ship our goods to the factories and from the factories is the railroad, and we're going to get taken to the cleaners." So we're behind the forestry, the reforestation, because we need a viable alternative to the railroad. I never knew that, but it makes total sense that it took that number of people in the urban environment to get on board. Um, And then also, we had floods that put people out of work. In Manchester, Vermont, there was one that put 6,000 people out of work overnight in a textile mill, because of the clear cutting that had happened in the White Mountains, and the storm surge. The spring rains caused massive flood. And the other one was economic, which was tourism. There were one pastor in particular in the White Mountains had written extensively about, in fact, a very famous article in the Atlantic Monthly about how when you climb to the top of Mount Washington, you look down on devastated landscapes. Who wants to come here and go up there and see that? And so you had this really neat consortium of opinion growing because of different aspects of what forestry was doing.
And that really struck me. This is jumping a little further ahead in my notes, but that is fine. I was really struck by Huff's work with industry, like not even just a little bit. Like when he did, where is it? In January 1876, when he gets that money from the Congress, from the U.S. Congress, to start like figuring this out. He talked a bunch with not just preservationists, but also like lumber, salt, railroad, tanning industry. He like got passes from the railroads to scoot all over the West. So obviously they weren't mad at him, to collect his data. And I was sort of wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that? And also what we can learn from that as far as our current environmental
Oh my
challenges that we
gosh,
are
he was
facing.
amazing. So he not only did all of that, he went all over the country and cataloged what kind of trees grew where, what the best um, conditions were for growing them, um, how to propagate the trees, how to start seedlings. In the same report, which was over 660 pages, which he presented to Congress in but a
That was the
year,
short
yeah,
one.
in, in
The first one was
yeah,
1,100 pages.
This is the
in
Leslie
one
Knope of
year,
forestry.
you know, in like a
That's
year and a
amazing.
half. And he's like, here's what the curriculum should be in the forestry school. I mean, it's insane. And
Wow.
but absolutely, he was, again, his whole point was, I'm not here to put, and this is a consistent theme, as Pinchot very much thought the same, and TR urged him to sit down with people of differing opinions and sort of figure out the way forward together. There are a lot of lessons here. But Hough was one of the first, and he sat down with people and said, this is really about where are we going to be in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years? Are your
Mm.
kids going to be able to become foresters if we just keep doing this?
Mm.
And the seeds were sown, pardon the pun, for multi-use land usage, which
Mm.
obviously is still being practiced to this day. Even most of the state forests and all of the national forests are designed for multiple use, recreation, um,
Mm.
as well as lumbering and other extractive industries to a degree. And it's always been in the DNA. And I think that that's really positive.
Mm.
It's probably the only way this ever got put together.
Well, and you said like that it was, they go to these people and say like, what are your kids are not going to be able to be foresters because there will not be a forest. Was that something that spoke to those people, like those heads of industry? Were they?
Yes, by and large, yes. I mean, I
Yeah.
can't say they were all won over at the beginning, but sure,
Well,
but
sure.
it was all moving that way, and Huff was carrying the banner. He actually
Yeah.
rose to become, contrary to many people's understanding, including my own, before I wrote the book. Pinchot is largely hailed as the first chief of the um, of forestry, and he wasn't. He was the first chief of the U.S. Forest, um, National Forest. What am I trying to say? U.S. Forest Group. But Hough was first, and Hough
Hmm.
predated him. But unfortunately, Hough got booted out in a political play. People were afraid of how much influence he had, and so he was booted out, and they put in a horticulturist into the forestry position, which my understanding was he was largely from a sort of designing landscapes for cemeteries and whatnot.
Oh.
And Pinchot
Oh,
railed
boy.
against this guy's appointment. Yeah.
I have a quote from your book about it.
Oh,
His name was
Lord.
Yeah, Eggleston.
Eggleston. Dr. N.H. Eggleston was one of those failures in life whom the spoils of the system is constantly catapulting into responsible positions after 3 years of innocuous oh my goodness. I had to look up this word. I didn't know this word. Destitute. Dr. Eggleston in turn was
Right.
replaced.
Whoa.
Yeah.
What a burn. What a burn. That is
Yeah.
a read right there.
Yeah, the feel I was getting from it was very that meme that went around for a while, probably like 7 years ago, where there's like a very poorly drawn gold star and it
Right,
says, "You
right.
tried."
Yeah. You had
Oh my
one job,
gosh.
right?
Oh my-
Yeah.
You had one
You-
job.
Oh, I was going to say U.S. Forest Service. That's what I was trying to get around my head around, the Pinchot's first title. But it's really fascinating. And just to go back to quickly about differing points of opinion, there's one. I don't know if you got to this part of the book yet, but it's a really seminal moment where Pinchot gets sent out west to basically work with the foresters out there, even though they despised him. And he spent more than 2 days in the audience listening to these people berate him at the podium and call him every name in the book. And then finally, it's Pinchot's turn to speak. And he's introduced at the podium as the most evil man on the face of the earth, and has to walk up to the podium and speak to them. And his message was, despite what you've heard, I'm a forester just like you are. And I'm not here to take your job away. I'm here to help make sure you have one. And he made this scintillating speech. And he didn't quite get a standing ovation, but he turned the crowd around and set the stage for them to come on board with getting behind U.S. Forest Service. And it was a huge lesson for me, given today's environment especially. But, TR said, you need to go out there and lay out our point of view, come what may. And I think that for a great deal of the people sitting in the audience, they thought he really is one of us. He's not trying to be the one that's telling them what to do. He's trying to get them to help formulate a plan together about what to do. And that was huge. It was huge at the time, and I think it's still a great lesson.
Well, just being able to have that personal strength to sit there and listen to people tell you how terrible you are, and then get up on stage and talk to those same people. I mean, that's
Wow.
oh boy.
Yeah, but he gets the last word, and it seems like he knew how to do that. He sounds like he was this kind of
He was a pistol.
he knew
He was
how
a
to speak to
pistol.
people.
He was
a-
he was absolutely dedicated to getting this profession codified and off the ground. And he had people lined up to work with him that just wanted to work for him because he knew how to run an agency that people had say in. And one guy said, we'd walk through a flood or into a fire for Pinchot because we were doing something important. And he was quite a personality.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this when he showed up, this was so long ago when I read this, that there were like only like there was like one forester for like this absolutely ludicrous number
Right.
of miles that there's no way, and they were like being paid like barely enough to
Right.
like
They were given
Wow.
a rule book and a horse and told to ride into these
Wow.
massive land holdings and say, guess what? I'm a 24-year-old recent graduate of the Yale Forestry School who just barely knows how to ride a horse, and I'm here to tell you that the rules are changing and we need to work together. You know, and think
Wow.
about what that took. And once again, Pinchot,
Also think about the average
yeah,
24-year-old too.
and once
Like
again, Pinchot, out of his own pocket, it would later be found out that largely when the winter came, they'd move back to D.C., and Pinchot, out of his own pocket, would pay their room and board for the winter and actually give them a raise
Wow.
over what the government had paid them when they're out in the spring, fall, and summer in uh, New Mexico or wherever it may be, Idaho or whatever. Um, it was an amazing time, and what's really cool to me is that um, the forestry movement started before the national park movement. It was something that was
right.
Mm,
identified
That
as
surprised me.
being critically
mm.
important to the country, even before the national parks came into being.
Yeah, I made a note earlier on that when they made the where is it? The s- when in 1872 in New York, the New York Senate uh designed to preserve forests and game land in northern New York, and they used the word park, and that was like a big like it sounds like political mistake because people heard park and they're like, oh, this is just where like rich people are gonna go
Huh.
Right.
like I don't know
Preserve. Right.
shoot squirrels
Right.
or
And
whatever.
the Adirondacks are interesting because Pinchot was among those who was really trying to sell the idea of scientific forestry to be what replaced all that clear cutting. And due to a number of
Mm.
hiccups in managing that land, and the fact that the land had been devastated to such a degree, the reaction from most people there was, we don't want foresters. Look what foresters did already. So he was
Oh,
trying to
wow.
rewrite the rules, but nobody wanted to listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. He did. So one of my favorite things about that report you talked about, that was 650 pages, but originally 1100, is that there were supposed to be 100,000 copies of the report printed just because that was just, I guess, what they did with reports like that in those days. And the committee on printing like freaked out. They were like, we cannot print 100,000 copies of this 1100-page document. You need to pare it down. So he removed all the statistical stuff, and then it was only 650 pages, and they copied 25,000 copies. And then he wrote another report which was limited to 1,900 copies, um, which he seemed
Right.
pretty irritated about.
And
Um,
then,
because he wanted this to be like spread around and not just given to
right.
the house. I mean, the house is important. Like these would be distributed to the house, maybe distributed
And
wider
then
than that
Huff
usually.
started the first forestry journal, which is another sort of wild thing that is lost to history. Unfortunately, he couldn't get enough subscribers because there were not enough people yet in the movement for sustaining a magazine. So it lasted about a year. But he was the guy. I mean, he wrote the first forestry journal. Um,
Hmm.
Amazing.
Someone had to make LexisNexis, not LexisNexis, but
Yeah,
Netscape before
right.
you could have. Yeah. So one thing I thought was really interesting was the governmental side, which isn't surprising because I'm a politics nerd. But I had a little trouble following it a little bit just because the forestry work kept bouncing between departments. Like nobody quite knew whose responsibility it was. What did that do, positive or negative, to like the legitimization of forestry
It
in
stalled it.
as a
It
governmental
stalled it for
body?
about 15 years, and when Pinchot first was hired to be the head of the Forest Service, he was an advisor. Basically, none of the land was under his purview. It was over in Interior. So the Department of Interior had all of the existing forest land that had been carved out, and Pinchot had no official capacity in managing that. All he could do was sort of give advice, and which was largely ignored because the timber industry wanted things to keep going the way they were going. And so then Congress at the same time was threatening to take away Pinchot's department and position, um, in reverse order, and said, there's no need for this department. You're not doing anything. And Pinchot, being brilliant, said, okay, I can't manage federal land, but I can advise private landowners how to manage their forests. So he printed a circular called Circular Number 21, and it's about how to manage forests privately, and thought, I'm going to prove that there's viability here, that people are going to ask for people to help manage their forests. And it was wildly successful. It was within a year, 21 states were represented by people who wanted to have Pinchot send young foresters to them to help advise them on how to manage their forests. And that really saved his job.
Well, yeah.
Wow.
And it's really like the perfect era for that too, because you've got these Gilded Age, like new money folks who are trying to figure out how to spend their money besides on platinum wallpaper.
Right.
See the breakers. And I mean, they're doing that too. But, you know, they're like, here in Philadelphia, almost all of our libraries were paid for by Carnegie. But I guess you talked about one person who had this like huge forest, and he was just like, I don't know, man,
Right.
do your thing.
Right.
Forest
Well, it
it.
was Olmsted again who got hired to do the landscape at the Biltmore estate, and it was 85,000 acres or some ridiculous amount, most of which had been clear cut. And Olmsted said, "Man, I'm maxed out. I'm trying to do your gardens and the Chicago World's Fair and 5 other projects. So why don't we hire this kid named Gifford Pinchot? He's just learned about forestry in Europe." And that was his first gig, was to try to prove the viability of forestry, and that provided the springboard for him to become a national celebrity and first forester. But but this privately owned land and farming government employees out to help advise these landowners on how to take care of and manage their forests for production was a huge success. And basically, when he became the head of the Forest Service, he published the first 6 months after the control. I should mention how he got control was he kept hitting his head against the wall with trying to get it done to move the lands over from interior to agriculture so that he could administer how the lands would be managed. Even though Roosevelt was on board with him, they still didn't have the political clout to get it done in Congress. So Pinchot had set up a conference and invited people from across the spectrum. So it was Weyerhaeuser was there, a number of forestry and lumber operations, and also people from other parts of the government that would be affected by the forestry departments, such as other departments of interior that were threatened. They all came to the conference, and there were also people there from the railroads and whatnot. And so the shippers, and he got them to get on board with the idea of bringing all of it over to his side of the ledger. And within 21 days of the conference ending, Roosevelt signed it with Congress's blessing over to Pinchot's purview. So he was now running the show.
And it's such a, like, my brain, sorry. But like Huff was doing so much of the like just groundwork to get him there. I thought it was sort of interesting that everybody was going to Europe to forestry schools there.
We didn't have
It just
any.
seemed fascinating to me.
Right.
I know, but like they have like
this is
different
so
trees and
funny.
stuff. And it's just also like, I'll go into this later. I think it's the whole like wilderness movement is so funny. But the when he came back, so Huff went to Europe and like went to all like
Which
tour
part
all
of
these
Europe?
schools and stuff.
Germany was
Germany
was
mostly.
the sort of, I'm going to mix metaphors here, but Germany was the creme de la creme. Germany was the top one, and France was not far behind. They were both highly regarded.
Yeah. I was wondering if it was Germany because we were just there and we were just in the Huts, which they have a literal, this is mind blowing. They have a literal, okay, there was a huge blow to the Harz Mountains, the forests in the last few years, which was, I think it's a type of beetle. I forget. It was basically around 2020, this beetle like took over and just wiped out just tons of these trees. And we went on this, and there was actually a monument there to the trees that had died, like this incredibly huge monument. And I was like, oh, this must be to a person.
To the
No, it was like
forest.
to the hundreds of thousands of the trees that we lost. And they had all these signs up, these informational signs, basically being like, don't worry, like this is really bad right now, but here's what we're doing to fix it, and like here's what we see as going ahead. And it's pretty incredible what they're up to. And so my first thought was like, oh my gosh, he must have gone to Germany because
he did. And he had lots of books. Yeah. They actually hired someone to help him like read the books that were in German.
That's awesome.
But when he came back from Europe, that's when he lost his job.
Oh wow.
To this mediocre
right, Eggleston,
right. And what I thought was so just impressive is that he kept working in the department. Even though he went from being like the head to just one of the agents.
It was the mission that was most important, right?
That's how much he cared.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
I just think that shows a lot of like, I don't know what the word is.
Dedication, right?
Personal strength, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, so he keeps on writing. It seems to be the theme through his life. Is he just keeps
Bless
writing.
his heart, you know. He did a lot of writing, and talk about dedication.
Yeah, he founded the American Journal of Forestry, which was short-lived. In 1882, he prepared his Elements on Forestry, which was the first attempt to present the principles of forestry in English and in one volume. Wow. It must have been a very large volume.
Wow.
He lived to see New York State found the first state forestry commission with actual administrative power, and the creation of the Catskill and Adirondack preserves. And he died in Lowville in 1885, and his home is a National Historic Landmark.
Wow.
And yeah, he's just one teeny tiny part of this whole movement that I know, like I said before, like I took a class on most of my history education has been very much East Coast based, but I took a class on the American West. And I definitely got this feeling of like, I don't know, Roosevelt just like said, that land over there, that's ours now. And that's what I loved about your book was it didn't just talk about these people I'd heard of, but it went back to like their fathers and like what their fathers were doing that inspired them.
When I started whiteboarding out the book and putting the characters on the wall, I was really taken by that. I was initially trying to do a sort of finding your roots of the conservation movement, and the roots got so intertwined that it was difficult. But I think I hope to think that I struck the right balance, because I really feel strongly about the people who set people up for success. And that's why your show resonates so much, is that the D-listers, without them doing the
Yeah.
food prep, we wouldn't have the buffet, right? It's like,
Yeah.
he was one of those people. And I won't get sidetracked, but Benton Mackay was another. And he, all of the people who sort of did this had these DNA of, I'm going to try to be all these different things. And it's not really clear when they're doing them, because they seem disparate. I'm going to be an author. I'm going to be a fruit farmer. I'm going to be a merchant marine. I'm going to, and then all of a sudden they end up designing Central Park. And you're like, if you look back and you say, oh my gosh, everything that they did led them to become the guy who designed Central Park. But when he was doing it, you're like,
Yeah.
a fruit farmer to a novelist to a merchant marine. It doesn't seem to be making sense. But all of those things, and his ability to see Europe and see how parks were designed and how important they were to people's ethos and sense of well-being, and all that were what led Olmsted to be Olmsted, or Pinchot to be Pinchot, or Hough to be Hough. And
Yeah.
that, I think, is one of the cool parts of history.
It's fascinating. One thing that I'm wondering about, and this is not something that I know much about at all, but did he have any contact with native like tribes like that were doing any type of forestry at that time? What if so, what did
I
it look
think
like?
most of his stuff would have been sort of choreographed, unfortunately, in the way that he was traveling through the West. But I also think that the kind of quote unquote forestry that the natives were doing was so opposite of the sort of clear cutting model. It was, what we'll cut enough to heat
Yeah.
ourselves or to smoke meat or whatever, and then that's it. I mean, it's almost like leave no trace.
Yeah.
And so I think that was fairly, if it was seen, it probably wasn't even realized that they were leaving such a light imprint.
This is something that actually I found really interesting even before this, because whenever I read about these guys, there is this part of me that is like, you're reinventing the wheel. But they had to reinvent the wheel, because this is how history went. But it's I don't know a ton about this, but I've heard and did a little tiny bit of research that before colonizations, this is before all these guys showed up, that forest maintenance done by indigenous nations was like just so different from what we do today, where it was interesting because these European colonists showed up and said, oh my gosh, this place is amazing. There's like berry bushes along the trails that are edible.
How did they get there?
This just magically happened.
Yeah.
That's part of why I think the wilderness movement is so funny. Because like most of this space was managed.
Yeah.
And then colonization happened, and then it just started getting cut down, because that's just what
this is so interesting, because that's exactly like what you both are mentioning here, that I'm like, this is what I imagine it was. It's kind of after the era that that a lot of these tribes have sadly been pushed out or killed and all of these things. And so then you have the industrialists come in and they're doing all this clear cutting, and just like you said, he comes in, it's like sort of reinventing the wheel. It's like we have to figure out a different way, another way of doing all of this, but it's like, just looking at your book and this history, it's I've never really paused to think what would have happened if we didn't have if someone with someone at that level of power, like, and people behind him hadn't stepped in and done something. And then the question also being, like, that I'm also wondering about is, how can this be like, how can we replicate this? Like, what is, I mean, so much has changed since that era, like, how can we do this today? Because one of the things that struck me is how, as you were saying that, like, when he told people that, what are we going to do in 10, 20, 40 years, that really resonated with people in the way that today, ever since you have like scorched earth policy and, the folks that came in Reagan, you have these guys who are like, who, the world's going to end anyway. Like, they actually are starting to think like, we don't care about the next 10 or 20, 50 years. And so how do we, this is something I know nothing about, but I'm like, what can we, I imagine
well,
we
I
learn a
think
lot from him.
what I originally had thought was I was going to end my book with the passage of the Wilderness Act in '64, and I thought, well, there's a lot of time between 1964 and now. What's happening now? So I added an extra chapter at the end to speak to what is happening now, and I'm really enthused about some of the initiatives that are happening now. And I know this is a whole other like big lead up conversation, but in a nutshell, what we had until about probably 15 years ago was, maybe even 10, was if you were concerned about the environment, you were either sort of pigeonholed or asked to declare yourself informally. Are you a preservationist or a conservationist? Do you want to save the land and have it be left alone, or do you believe that the land should be managed in some form for game, for species that live on it, as well as not just trees, but other, just should the deer herd be managed, etc. And what's happening now is the lines are blurring, and particularly on lands that can hold both, which I think is fascinating because we need to figure out a way, I think, to coexist. It doesn't have to be black or white. It doesn't have to be preserved or managed. It can be preserved and managed. And there's a really unique organization called Northeast Wilderness Trust. And what they're doing is they're rewilding lands that have been largely clear cut and or ruined temporarily, and they're trying to reforest them and bring them back. And as part of that, they're pooling money with conservationists, with foresters, with forest companies, forest products companies, and saying, what if we pool our money and get this tract of land? Can we have some of it be forever in recreation and forever wild status? And can we have more of some of it be selectively cut? And one of the initiatives that's coming out of that, which is really mind blowing, is a whole initiative to build giant wooden beams, laminated beams for commercial sized buildings, not just for homes, but to replace steel beams with wood that's locally harvested, as opposed to locally harvested and managed for the next 20 years more can be harvested, instead of having it poured in a foundry halfway around the world and shipped here, which has huge carbon footprint ramifications and everything else. And it's just such neat thinking. It's starting to take off and become something viable, and I think that's really exciting. The old trees can stay old long enough to continue to be carbon sinks effectively themselves. But then when they're starting to age out and they're sort of on the cusp of, we need to have these come out, the ones that are coming up behind them are large enough to take their place. So it's a really neat, I think, way of looking at the resource and the possibilities.
Yeah. I love that because, like, I'll be honest, I never even thought about the impact of steel beams on the environment. And this is all like right now in Philadelphia feels very present because like today we had a code orange again because of the Canadian wildfires. Like, I looked out the window of my office and I was like, well, at least I can see the skyscrapers this time. They're a little hazy, but they're out there. And it's just like, it's all this stuff. Which I'm curious about what challenges you feel like our national parks face today. I admit, for a long time, my experience with national parks was I would give money every year to the Independence National Historic Park, so that I could be a tour guide. But then I started following the national parks on social media, not because I reached out to it, but because it was so funny.
Oh my
They post
gosh.
the
Yes.
funniest stuff.
Yes. I know.
Oh, I need to follow them.
Yeah.
What?
You need to
There's
follow
nothing
them.
to
They're
do
so
here.
good.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
There's nothing to do here. That's the whole idea. You go out and enjoy nature, right? Yeah. Yeah. Some of the comments are funny. I think
Yeah.
I think there are a
that's
number of
great.
challenges right now with the national parks. One is they've become very popular, and that's a great thing, and it's a resource management challenge. It's how do we make sure that the parks can withstand the visitorship that they get. Um, the great thing about one silver lining thing, I won't say a great thing about COVID, but one silver lining thing that came out of the COVID experience was people spending more time outdoors and discovering the power of being in nature. And however, that usership has been a real challenge for infrastructure and things like maintaining steps and trails. And the most popular places get loved to death, and some of the lesser known,
Yeah.
the Franklin Benjamin Houghs of the national park system, do not get seen as much. So, I always tell people it's a good idea to try to visit some of the lesser visited ones. You have a more wonderful experience, and you're not fighting for campground space. But it's a big challenge for them. It has been from the beginning, really. How do you maintain that balance between having a place that's really special and having it stay that way?
And this is something we're always talking about in tourism, because if you're successful in tourism, you run the
Right.
risk of loving it to death. Like you said, the tourists, even the most conscientious tourists, have an impact on the space that they're visiting. And I can say, like, one thing that I'm aware of, even though I don't work in the West, but I have a lot of colleagues who do, and they're talking about a lot about how they've deeply limited the number of motor coach licenses that they're giving out. And they're doing it, I think, in a really smart way, because they're giving it to, some company will apply and pay the whatever they need to get their license for the season. But it's like per company has a license for the season, and they're allowed to share them.
Right.
Which I think is really smart, because
Right.
that's what they're really trying to do, right? They're trying to make it that there's
Right.
only this many motor coaches coming in each day or whatever. So it's not like quite as
Right.
arduous as it could be. So tour guides, we're always upset about anything that makes
Well,
our
it's
lives
funny.
harder. Because I've been hearing all
It's
about
funny
this.
as someone who's spent a lot of time on the Appalachian Trail, even places that are designed for foot travel are seeing unprecedented use. And
Yeah.
some of the reasons we go out there are not to be around crowds. So how do we manage that? One of the things that I think the Appalachian Trail Conservancy is doing a great job of is trying to get people to start at different places on the trail, rather than everybody go to Georgia in March and early April and try to go north in a big
Yeah.
bubble. How about if you
Yeah.
started in Maine and went south? Or what happens if you started in Harper's Ferry and went north, and then went down to Atlanta and hiked back to Harper's Ferry or something? They call it flip-flopping.
Well, and you've done a lot of this, right? Of like doing the Appalachian
Yes.
Trail in
Over
sections.
28 years to finish it.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
So I'm curious then, like, what suggestions you would have for someone who has no real outdoors experience. Like, I know I'm an inside kid. My wife grew up going to like summer camp in Georgia, where she was like, I always joke saying that she was bivouacking, and she's always like, we weren't bivouacking. But to someone who went to like
Yep.
theater camp,
Well, you
it seems
camped.
like bivouacking.
Um,
We had air
there you go.
conditioning in our spaces.
Baby steps. Baby steps. I mean, first of all, spend some time making sure that footwear is the right size and blister proof. You know, get your footwear and walk around town a bit, break them in. But I always tell people the best thing to do, two things. One is if you're a total newbie, go with someone who is more experienced, and you can do that by joining a meetup or a lot of the outdoor stores or outdoor groups. Um, they're everywhere. You can find people to go with just to kind of learn the basics. But the other piece of it too, for me, is if you're buying equipment, set it up, get used to it. Learn how to cook on your camp stove in the backyard or in a park. Set up your tent in a park or a backyard. Um, get your flashlight and in a top pocket of your pack nearby, because I always tell people there's nothing to ruin your camping time than to have to learn how to set up a tent in the dark for the first time, or God forbid it's pouring rain and you're trying to set this thing up and you're getting soaked. So, it's just basic stuff like that, and keep it simple. Make something easy for dinner. Um, Lord knows there's enough stuff in the one pot cooking aisle in the store, or instant soup, or um, God forbid ramen. I'm ramen. I'm ramened out. We declared on the trail the fall of the ramen empire. There,
I love the culture of the Appalachian Trail.
it's
I'm
great,
thoroughly
and
fascinated by it.
that's it. Just start out easy and find a group. Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, Keystone Club, any of them. That outdoor stores, REI, LL Bean, all of them. They all have outing groups that can help you get your feet under you and have a good time. And the other piece is don't get too aggressive with your mileage estimates when you start out. Just take it easy. Stop, take pictures, drink plenty of water, bring a water filter with you, and have fun.
I love that. Thank you.
And also, we sorry, that was I just needed to throw in that we were out talking about national parks today. I got lost in Yellowstone for 7 hours with my dad because
I forgot about that.
we went on the wrong trail. We thought it was the trail going back to the parking lot, and because he was like, oh, they're all orange. Though he was like, it's the orange trail, but they were all orange. So we went on like the outward bound. But that's my only piece of advice. Don't just follow the color of the trail.
Right.
Know what trail it is first. Don't do it, because you'll end up like me and you'll say, I never want to go back to Yellowstone again. And look at all the beautiful things I'm missing out on by never going back to Yellowstone because I'm too scared of it.
Funnily enough, yeah, I have a similar story from Iceland where my ex took me on what he said. He's like, do you want to go on a little walk? And I said, sure.
It always starts with a little walk. And then you get lost.
Just a little further.
And he took the wrong turn, and they didn't have like blazes in the same way that we do, but like, to be fair to me and not to him, he messed up. I realized later there is a giant arrow made of rocks right there that he just walked by, and I trusted him, and that was a mistake. And we ended up on like the old like Viking trail where we had to like climb up sheer rock. It was the most terrifying.
Oh my goodness! We have similar.
I found out later that particular trail we were on, that little walk, was the most challenging non-technical hike in Europe. I'll tell you what. When we got up there, it was gorgeous.
I'm sure. Sadly, the Yellowstone walk was not even that pretty. It was like the walk that nobody does, because there's no reason.
Just
not
outward
a good
bound.
One.
But
just out there.
The other piece of advice, given wayfinding advice, is there are a couple great apps that pinpoint you right where you are on the trail.
Amazing.
One of them is called, that I really enjoy, is called Gaia GPS, GAIA. It's great. And you can take pictures on your hike, and it tells you what your average speed is and where you're at and all that stuff. And, the only caveat to that is you have to have a charged phone or an iPad, or you can't drop it in the
Yeah.
stream. But I think that it's a good thing to have.
Yeah.
And
This is making me excited
I
to go,
I
to get
always
out
take
there.
pictures of
Yeah.
the trailhead of the map that they have. That's the other
Smart.
one, is
Yes.
take a picture,
Yes.
because
Critical.
your description might have
Mhm.
changed. In rare cases, the trail gets fixed or rerouted or whatever, but they're always up to
Uh-huh.
date on the
Uh-huh.
kiosks. You take a picture of the map on the kiosk,
Got it.
and when you're hiking
Ah.
along, you can even blow it up on your phone and go, "Oh, this is where we're
Yeah.
at." So there
All
you go.
right. I
That's
will do that next time. Yes.
that's smart. Oh my gosh, what was my thought? Oh, I can't get over the idea of, just what popped in my head was this idea that Huff would have been so into all of these like Fitbits and all these apps that track like how fast you go, and
Oh,
how
he would have been.
like
He would
he
have
would have
had
been
all
all
his
about that.
stats, and then he would have released a report about all of his stats for everybody to read.
On Instagram.
And not
Oh my gosh.
not to mention, Cornell has an app where you can hold it up and it will tell you what bird you're listening to.
I've heard of this. And I was gonna try to download that app and see if it could pick up any of the birds in South Philly, even though they probably won't be as diverse as some other areas.
I'd be curious, because I don't know if you
Yes.
realize this, Lisa, because we don't usually hear it in the moment, but when I go back to edit, there is
Right.
always bird chirping on
That's
your
so
thing.
funny. That is so funny. I moved here partially for the birds. There's a lot of birds in South Philly, and I moved here from Center City because I felt, really, because my cat loves, he's a hunter. He's vicious, and he loves little animals
TV.
that he can intimidate.
Right.
And he loves his TV. And I was feeling so bad for him, because I lived in this skyscraper in downtown where he saw no birds almost ever. And now we're here in Philly, in South Philly, and he's living it up, and we're hearing birds all the time. So I think I'm gonna get that app, and I want to know what birds these are, because some of them are
That's
really
great.
freaking cute. They're so cute. I don't know what I think they're eating a lot of pizza. We have a lot of Italian food down here, because we have some chunky birds on my back porch all the time. I don't know what they're eating, but they are chunky and they're adorable.
Yo, well, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for coming in. Yeah, this was amazing.
Yes.
Issa and I are just always talking over each other. It's fine. So plug your
Well,
stuff.
I've got several books out. In fact, you mentioned the Appalachian Trail book. That was called Appalachian Odyssey, and it's basically a 28 chapter book. Each chapter is about how we did a different section of the trail every year. A newfound friend of mine and I, who ended up being like a brother by the time we finished our almost 30-year quest. And I think we're into year 39 now of going on a hike every year together. So that's been pretty cool.
Wow.
And then my second book was about the history of the trail, called Blazing Ahead. And then I took a little bit of a turn, a la Frederick Law Olmsted and Mr. Hough, and did a book about a hermit that lived in Monson, Maine, and ran an illegal smuggling ring between the 1890s and 1930s. And it's largely based on fact, and no one could figure out where he got his wealth until he was on his deathbed and told people he had buried 40,000 in gold near his cabin, which has never been found, by the way. So that one's called Hermit: The Mysterious Life of Jim White. And then, as has been mentioned many times, my newest book came out last year. It's a hardcover called This Land Was Saved for You and Me. And you can find where to buy them on my website, jeffryanauthor.com, and all the various places you can buy them, some well-known and some the D-listers of bookstores. But you will find them.
Yes, I have the Blazing
Great.
Ahead. I'm very excited to read it at some point, especially after reading about Mackay in this book.
Yeah,
He
both
sounds
both
like
of them are
character. So
characters.
I'm looking forward to it.
Avery was Steve Jobs on steroids. He wanted this thing built, and it was his way. And he made a few
Yeah,
friends
I didn't talk about
and a
any
lot
of
of
that part of the
enemies.
book, but there's
there you have it.
but yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot of drama. Um, so thank you everyone so much for listening to Delicious of History. If you enjoyed yourself, be sure to subscribe and drop us a review on whatever platform you listen on. A huge thank you to April Keys for the use of the song Misfit from her album Mountain View. You can find her on all the social media platforms. And also a big congratulations to April Keys. Issa and I were just at her baby shower this
Yes.
past weekend. So I texted her before we recorded, and she said we could mention baby Keys.
Oh,
So
great.
it's very
Mazel tov,
exciting.
April and baby Keys. Yes.
Yes, also in Maine, actually. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Delicious of History, no hyphens. A big shout out to the folks supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support us and get access to all sorts of exclusive content, like Delish Drabbles and stickers. There's new stickers coming out. I'm very excited.
Yay.
Very excited for these stickers. Become a patron of this program, like Labor John. Just plug them again because we're podcast
Is Labor John a
BFFs.
patron?
Yeah.
That's so lovely. Thank you, Labor John.
And all this and more can be found on our website, deliciousofhistory.com. Again, no hyphens. And our next, I should have looked at this ahead of time. I was like so proud of myself. I'm like, I have this document up. I am ready to go. And I don't have a calendar up. Our next episode will be coming out August 21st. And it's going to be pretty great. So, and now for an episode relevant audio drop.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try.
Only you.
Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rip-top money. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.